Okay, let's just dive right in. We often talk about global tensions, right, and how they exist on this kind of spectrum. From diplomatic friction to economic pressure, all the way to proxy conflicts. But every so often, a statement comes along that tries to shift that entire spectrum.
And that's what we're looking at today.
That is precisely what happened with Iranian President Massoud's recent nationally televised address. Our sources today are focused completely on this one speech because it contained a declaration that, for Iran, immediately redefines the state of play. Massoud claimed without any ambiguity that Iran is now in a full-scale war.
That is the headline. And it forces you to just pause, because when you and I hear full-scale war, we picture something very specific.
Conventional forces, an invasion.
Exactly. Clear battle lines. But Massoud is defining something entirely different. And he specifically named his adversaries, the United States, Israel, and key European nations.
So the mission for this deep dive is to really get inside that definition. How does Massoud characterize a full-scale war when there hasn't been a traditional invasion? And why does this specific, highly volatile declaration matter so much to you, who's trying to make sense of all the information coming out of the Middle East?
Right.
We need to look past the rhetoric and get to the specific details and stakes involved, according to the sources.
We have to start with just the sheer resolve in his message. The whole address was really a firm rejection of any international call for Iran to scale back its military or its regional operations.
He wasn't negotiating.
Not at all. He stated very plainly, and this quote really sets the tone for everything. He said, "They want us to surrender, but now we are stronger than before."
That's a bold statement, especially when Iran is facing such intense coordinated pressure. So what's the immediate context here?
The context is absolutely crucial. This announcement comes amid severely escalating regional tensions. We're talking about a period marked by intensified layered sanctions and very significant, very public military posturing from the U.S. and its allies.
Okay.
And Massoud framed this moment not as a crisis for Iran, but as a pivotal turning point. He argued his adversaries just fundamentally miscalculated. They thought that all this pressure would lead to compliance or maybe even collapse.
And he's saying the opposite happened.
He's saying it backfired completely, that it's forged a more resilient, more unified nation that's determined to resist.
So if this is a full-scale war without tanks crossing borders, what does that battlefield actually look like? Massoud must be laying out some kind of coordinated campaign, not just a bunch of separate incidents.
That's the heart of it. That is his strategic repositioning. He explicitly accused Western governments of operating a single, coordinated campaign designed to force submission.
So he's not seeing them as three separate players, the U.S., Israel, Europe?
No, he sees it as a unified front, where each one is playing a specific role.
And what's the role he alleges each one is playing? What's the objective, according to him?
He claims that the Western powers are using Israel as their direct military arm in the region to carry out the kinetic strikes.
Okay.
Meanwhile, European nations provide the essential political support, the diplomatic isolation, and, crucially, the economic warfare through these constantly tightening sanctions. The end goal, in his view, is the systemic weakening and maybe the eventual collapse of the Iranian regime.
All without the major powers having to commit their own ground troops.
Precisely. And that's why he can define it as a full-scale war. It covers the military, the economic, and the political domains all at once.
Let's talk about the strategic shift here, because this is huge. For decades, almost every major negotiation with Iran has been anchored around the nuclear issue, right? Enrichment levels, safeguards.
Always.
And Massoud is now saying that's over. He declared this conflict is not about nuclear issues anymore.
And the sources confirm that by decoupling the conflict from the nuclear file, he has just fundamentally redefined its scope. He's elevated it from a technical, verifiable dispute to something existential, a non-negotiable principle.
And what's the new goal?
His new stated goal is profound. He says this is about independence, dignity, and the right of nations to choose their own path.
Wow. I mean, that's a massive strategic maneuver. Because if your main objective is now dignity and self-determination, how does the West even begin to approach that? You can verify uranium enrichment.
Right.
How do you verify dignity?
You can't, and that's the core difficulty here. When a conflict is framed as existential a war for sovereignty against outside coercion, it makes compromise exponentially harder. It forces all of us as observers to recognize that every single action Iran takes now, from military posturing to cyber ops, is going to be justified under this broader existential framework of defending national honor.
And that reframing is key to understanding why he's using the term full-scale war, even without a conventional invasion.
Exactly. He's essentially saying that the sum total of all these pressures, the economic strangulation, the covert operations, the proxy conflicts, that they collectively are a state of total war.
And we are seeing this manifest in real physical hotspots right now.
Absolutely. Massoud's statement isn't just abstract rhetoric. It's grounded in real-time instability. We have major Israeli military operations happening right now in Gaza and southern Lebanon that directly involve the whole region.
And what about the network of allied groups Iran supports? We hear about them constantly, but how active are they in this definition of conflict?
The sources identify the full suite of Iranian-backed groups as active components here. So you have Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various Iraqi militias.
Right.
Now, Iran always maintains this crucial diplomatic distinction. It denies direct, real-time operational control over them, but it openly admits they share strategic goals.
And that strategic sharing is the key part.
It is. It means these groups act as force multipliers. They complicate the military calculus for the U.S. and Israel, and they let Iran exert regional influence without directly exposing its own military. In Massoud's framing, they are part of this full-scale war being waged against the coordinated West.
And the U.S. is clearly reacting to this, especially with the threats to global trade routes.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. response has been a substantial increase in its naval forces all across the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, and the public justification for this is countering threats to international shipping and maintaining stability, particularly given what the Houthis have been doing.
You mentioned the European nations playing the political and economic part of this. What does that diplomatic tightrope look like for them on the ground?
It's an almost impossible duality they're trying to manage. On one hand, European governments are publicly calling for immediate de-escalation, for humanitarian pauses.
Because they need stability for trade.
Of course. But at the same time, they remain fundamentally aligned with U.S. and Israeli policy positions, and they keep tightening sanctions on Iranian entities.
So they're trying to have it both ways.
You could say that. The difficulty is they want the immediate situation to cool down, but they refuse to relieve the underlying economic pressure. The very pressure Massoud says is the core of this full-scale war. So that refusal is seen by Tehran as just supporting the campaign, no matter what Europe's rhetoric is about peace.
And when you have all these elements converging, proxies, naval deployments, active operations, intense economic pressure, it certainly starts to feel less like a series of isolated events.
And more like the multifaceted conflict that Massoud described. And this is where that risk factor becomes just paramount. Military experts are ringing alarm bells, cautioning that these converging hotspots create an environment where the risk of a miscalculation is enormous.
And we're not just talking about a planned large-scale attack.
No, not at all.
Can you give us an illustration of that danger? What kind of mistake are we talking about?
Well, think about the sheer density of military and commercial assets in places like the Red Sea. A single drone, maybe it's misidentified as a bigger threat, gets shot down by a Western vessel.
Okay.
Or a naval commander on either side misinterprets a routine maneuver during a high-stress moment. An error in radar, a single stray missile. Any one of those could instantly escalate this from a proxy conflict to a direct kinetic confrontation between Iran and Western forces.
That is a razor's edge.
It absolutely is.
So given this incredibly volatile environment, Massoud's claim of strength and preparedness feels almost counterintuitive. How can Iran claim to be stronger and ready for a conflict with major world powers while also dealing with these massive sanctions?
His argument relies on showing tangible, homegrown capabilities. He gave specific evidence of preparedness, significant progress in missile technology, both precision and range-advanced drone capabilities, which are now, a staple of their influence.
And cyber warfare.
Right, robust cyber warfare capabilities, and a big increase in domestic weapons production. He argued that these advancements aren't just talking points. They represent a successful deterrent. By developing these low-cost, high-impact missiles and drones, Iran has made the cost of a direct conflict unacceptably high for its adversaries.
And he's using that survival narrative, specifically surviving the maximum pressure campaign from the U.S., to justify this new confidence. He's basically turning a crippling policy into a badge of honor.
It's the core of his message, but it is based on real policy. He talked about surviving maximum pressure, which for the average person in Iran meant not being able to sell oil, having bank accounts frozen, widespread isolation.
Yeah.
He says, we survived maximum pressure. We survived sabotage, assassinations, and isolation. What remains is a nation that learned how to stand on its own.
So that narrative frames years of acute economic pain not as a failure, but as this necessary, painful adaptation that ultimately makes them more self-sufficient.
That's the argument, that the sanctions campaign forced domestic economic adaptation. Because international banking and oil were so limited, the nation had to strengthen its own internal supply lines, its own manufacturing. And, just as importantly, it deepened strategic ties with non-Western nations.
Like China and Russia.
Specifically China, Russia, and countries in the global south. It created this sort of alternative economic axis that's less vulnerable to Western financial leverage.
Okay, that is the official narrative of resilience, but we have to provide the critical counterpoint here. Sanctions don't just forge geopolitical strength, they cause devastating human pain. What's the domestic reality that Masood is, well, largely glossing over?
The sources are very clear on this dichotomy. While Masood is focused on national power, domestic critics, economists, human rights groups, they argue that ordinary citizens are still suffering profoundly.
How so?
They're grappling with crushing inflation that just erodes any savings they have, persistently high unemployment, and just a general decline in living standards across the board.
So his speech didn't offer any solutions for them?
Virtually nothing. His speech was about the nation standing strong against the world, but it offered no concrete solutions for protecting civilians from the economic fallout of an even more intense confrontation. The counterpoint is that the national resilience Masood is claiming is being bought at the price of intense, ongoing individual suffering.
The domestic population is highly vulnerable.
Extremely, if the economic part of this full-scale war gets turned up even higher.
Let's pivot to the broader strategic implications. Why do security analysts find this idea of an existing full-scale war particularly troubling?
Because it fundamentally changes the rules of engagement. It changes the definition of what constitutes a retaliatory act. By framing the situation as an existing war, Masood provides justification for aggressively responding to any future U.S. or Israeli actions.
You can view any move against them
as just a continuation of a war that has already started.
Yeah.
Whether it's a covert op, a cyber attack, a regional strike, it's not a new event. It's just another battle in the ongoing war.
So it lowers the threshold for a major response.
Significantly.
Yeah.
Any future action by an adversary can now be framed as an act of escalation within an ongoing war, not the trigger of a new one. And that makes predicting Iran's response much, much more difficult.
And diplomatically, defining this as an existential war for dignity can't possibly help find a path to de-escalation.
No, it severely limits the diplomatic track. When a conflict is defined as existential, a fight for national survival, it makes compromise politically lethal for the leaders involved.
Right.
To concede on a point like dignity is politically risky at home, and this framing makes it way easier for the regime to justify further escalation to its own people.
But despite all the tough talk, our sources say Masood did provide a small window, a small opening for de-escalation, right? He didn't completely slam the door shut.
He did, as a very carefully crafted opening. While he was issuing the warning, he stated clearly that Iran does not seek war but will resist coercion. And he offered this specific caveat. Peace is built on respect, not threats.
So what does that demand for respect actually mean in practical terms? Does he want all sanctions lifted tomorrow, or is it something else?
It's an incredibly high bar. The demand for respect implies an immediate end to the entire policy of coercion. So, yes, a stop to economic sanctions, a stop to military posturing in the region, and a stop to what they see as interference with their alliances.
I see.
It's Masood signaling that for any negotiations to even resume, the U.S. and its allies must first accept Iran's regional role and stop trying to undermine the regime. That's his minimum requirement.
So, given all of this, the redefining of goals, the blurring of warfare types, the increased risk, what's the main takeaway for you, for the listener, trying to understand this incredibly complex situation?
The main insight is that the traditional lines we used to draw between a proxy conflict, economic warfare, and direct conventional war, they completely dissolved in the Middle East. The definition of full-scale war that Masood provided covers all these domains simultaneously. And the ability of global powers to prevent a disastrous kinetic escalation now depends entirely on how they respond to this new definition. The decisions made not just in Tehran, but crucially in Washington, in Tel Aviv, and in those European capitals.
So this deep dive into Masood's warning really reveals a fundamental and I think dangerous shift in the narrative. The conflict, as defined by one of the main actors, is no longer primarily about the technical details of a nuclear program or physical borders. It is officially, existentially, about national dignity and resisting coercion. It's blurring those traditional conflict definitions beyond recognition. So here's the final provocative thought for you to carry forward based on the sources we looked at today. If Massoud's definition holds that economic warfare, proxy conflicts, and cyber operations are now just elements of a full-scale war, what does that imply for the future of international relations and for the very definition of peace? Because if war is constant, happening across all these different dimensions, maybe peace, as we used to define it, is now just the temporary absence of a kinetic strike. Something to think about as you follow these headlines. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.